Oi, oi, it's your boy, Jack Slack, coming at you late in the week on account of the fact that I got the Rona. um, Nothing too bad. People were checking in on me, making sure I hadn't died, which I do appreciate everyone doing whenever I don't do something on time. But no, my sole symptom was just a really bad throat, really sore throat. And, I don't want to do podcasts with sexy deep voice. I want to do podcasts with effeminate British voice that everyone knows and loves. Still testing positive, so unfortunately we're going to a wedding at the weekend, and the wife doesn't want to get the Rona. So the house has been divided into my rooms and her rooms, and I'm currently locked up in some of mine using my emergency podcasting mic, which I bought a long time ago, and I hadn't even unwrapped, actually. It's a Blue Yeti. And my previous experience with Blue microphones was not great, so we'll see how that goes. It'll probably just annoy me because I have a very expensive setup in my actual office, but needs must, as they say. And I wanted to get something out about this event because there's a couple of interesting things on it. Mainly like the Khamzat Chimaev Gilbert Burns fight is what's intriguing me. It's kind of odd because it's sort of a all-in on Coca, but all-in on Dana sort of card, because a lot of the fights are, nothing's ever a foregone conclusion in this sport, obviously, but a lot of the fights you're looking at and going, I just cannot imagine, I cannot imagine, I've seen enough weird shit happen that I can imagine almost anyone chinning anyone. But, when you match up Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, I go, damn. There's a lot of ways those two could play off each other, and there's a lot of ways that could interact. Whereas when you match up Alexander Volkanovski with Korean Zombie, it's a little bit more, I know what to expect. I mean, the Aljamain Sterling one's actually a little bit less predictable than it. I think a lot of people should be a little bit less predictable than a lot of people are making it out to be, on account of the fact that most people seem to not remember most of the first fight. But this card has a lot of fights where, the two big fights have a sort of foregone conclusion thing about them, and the rest of the fights are sort of making other people look good. So Ian Gary is against some lad who doesn't have a win in only has a loss in the UFC. Mickey Gall is out there against someone who's never been in the UFC before. I saw someone trying to justify this card, and they go, the paid portion of it, and they're going, Vink Pachel, ranked heavyweight fight? You're going, well, what isn't a ranked heavyweight fight? The difference between a ranked heavyweight fight and an unranked heavyweight fight is nothing, because there are only 5 good heavyweights in the world at now, and if none of them are involved, who gives a shit? In fact, if you tell me that Jairzinho Rozenstruik is fighting Marcin Tybura, and then you tell me that Alexei Olenek is fighting Jared Vanderaa, I mean, that's a real 50-50, I don't know what would end up worse. Probably, at least, Olenek's going to either submit this guy quickly or lose embarrassingly. With Rozenstruik and Tybura, I know that I'm probably getting not fun. But it's a strange one, and the compelling one on it is Khamzat Chimaev versus Gilbert Burns, which is a fight that I've looked into a little bit. I've had a lot of time because I've been ill, so I haven't really been doing anything except sitting around and watching fights, because it's not like I can go anywhere or train or whatever. And to be fair, actually, I've done quite well, because I think it was about this time last year things started opening up. And I managed to grapple or kickbox most days. Yeah, done pretty well to not manage to get anything up till now, I'd say. I said to my wife, I knew it would be my smashing my face into other men's chests every day that got me in the end. Still never had a staph infection, though, which speaks to, I don't know, the cleanliness of my training partners or the cleanliness of the gyms I go to. Or that I just shower like I've been covered in acid the moment I get off the mats. But yeah, so I've been sitting around watching Gilbert Burns fights and Khamzat Chimaev fights. Khamzat Chimaev is one of those fighters I have a difficult relationship with, because I don't really... When people are super hype about a fighter and there isn't a lot of footage, I feel like it's very tacky to then do 100 videos on them. And there are lots of people on this very platform who have done that. That would be me pretending to know something about this fighter, or to have gleaned something about this fighter from very little footage. But then, I looked back at it and I realised he's had 4 fights in the UFC now, so he's done a fair bit. And I scoured out all the pre-UFC fights I could. And, I'm getting sort of a read on him, but it's just sort of like everyone has lost him so quickly. Everyone has played into his game so quickly. And it's kind of, I'm always going to liken it back to Ronda Rousey because that's the most flagrant example of this in this sport's history. I remember talking about the things that I would want to see someone do against Ronda Rousey, and it wasn't me saying you need to be able to do this, this, and this to an elite level. It was me saying I don't understand why everyone she's fought has come out and immediately squared up and thrown the right hand at her, because she's either going to duck it and get into the clinch or take it on the face with her beautiful head movement, champ, and get into the clinch. Trying to chin someone as soon as possible when all they want to do is tie up is the worst possible strategy in any combat sport. And I remember saying that, and I remember saying, I wish these people would just try and circle a bit first and not hit the fence immediately, not back right onto it. And people were telling me, like, no, it's just that Ronda's that good. And I'm going, no, these are things that someone can do to make Ronda do more. And as it turned out, when someone did come along and do it to a good level, Ronda didn't know how to deal with it at all. Now, let's remove that from a direct comparison just for a moment and say that I'm not saying that Khamzat Chimaev is Ronda Rousey. I'm saying that I've watched an awful lot of people come out and try and throw the right straight at him off the bat, and it never ever works. I put up a clip on Twitter. I think it was 3 or 4 of his opponents, and he's only had like 8 or 9, but 3 or 4 of them come out in the first round and immediately throw the right hand, and he gets underneath the right hand. And if you throw your right hand, you square your hips up and you give them everything they want. So there were a couple of lads on the regional scene, but Li Jingliang did it in his last fight. Li Jingliang came out, touched gloves, bounced a little bit, and then stepped in to throw a 1-2. And you're going, what was your plan there? The man's good at dropping underneath punches anyway, because I've seen him fight. One of the examples I gave was who was the lad he fought in was it his UFC debut? Hold on. I'll pull up his record. That's probably an easier way to do this. Yeah, John Phillips in his UFC debut. Khamzat comes out. John Phillips obviously wants to strike. Khamzat Chimaev obviously wants to wrestle. You could tell that from the Amish beard. That's all you need. But Khamzat comes out, throws a high kick, first exchange, and immediately John Phillips swings back as hard as he can and as wide as he can. It was like the level change DJ did on Rod Tang the other week. Kick, they will come back, you level change underneath it. It's what Colby Covington does all the time. If you're a wrestler, go out and throw high kicks, because people take them and they go, fuck, that's dangerous. People who otherwise are fine with you swinging at their head go, that's dangerous, knock that off, and they try and hit you in the head to get you back and to convince you not to do it again. But all that happened was that Khamzat went head kick, duck. And John Phillips threw back. Khamzat's already on his hips. And this is the trade-off, not the trade-off, this is the difference between wrestling and MMA wrestling. In wrestling, everyone's bent over at the waist with their head like level with their hips, and you've got a lot of work to do to get in on their hips. In MMA, as soon as anyone wants to throw a punch, you can't throw a punch bent over at the waist. You can try, but then you're Nasrat Hakparast. But the entire stand-up game works around being stood upright, where you can rotate your hips and your shoulders are on top of them. So the moment you start throwing right hands, you're standing still, you're squaring your hips up. The ideal time to hit a double leg is when the guy is square and his head's a little bit too high. And your head's always going to be too high if you're busy trying to throw punches. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, of the 8, how many opponents he had? 9 opponents. Of the 9 opponents he's had, 4 of them I've seen just try and swing at him off the first exchange. And a couple of them I haven't been able to find. So that's not really representative. But what Chimaev does, generally, in the few rounds that he's actually fought, is set up his takedowns very well, set up his entries very well. One of the interesting things that I found when I was watching back from the start of his career, at the beginning of his career, he's using his wrestling to try and get into top positions and do BJJ top work. And so he's like trying to mount people or trying to hit them from knee on belly. Things that you don't really see anymore. And Craig Jones just put out a great instructional about this. I think it's called power pinning. Can't remember what it's called, but it's really good. And Craig basically talks for quite a while about how like the best positions for top control wise are not the ones that are currently scored by the IBJJF. That's kind of a old school understanding of it. and you could see this like readily. Would you rather have side control on someone like Kelvin Gastelum, or would you rather have like quarter mount where you're on one of their legs and you've got their hand trapped behind their back like a Dagestani handcuff? That's probably about the best position you can get in MMA nowadays to hit from and to control from. And obviously the answer is to be in the quarter guard, but that's not at all scored in IBJJF. And it's quite interesting because Khamzat starts his MMA career, with all this wrestling experience, but doing the BJJ top game, and then he starts gravitating more towards the Khabib sort of meta that has come up as his career goes along. On the feet, I think his best assets are that he's game, that he is willing to kick freely. And a lot of the takedowns that don't happen when the guy immediately swings on him at the start of the round, a lot of the people he's taken down have been taken down off naked low kicks, which he gets them to throw by throwing low kicks at them. It's genius. If you kick someone in the leg, they will kick you in the leg back. And if you're waiting on that and you just grab it and bundle them over, it works a charm. So it's high kicks into level changes, it's low kicks to get the return and then run down the centre and take them down. But the other one is that he loves his inside slip. And the inside slip is, if you are, we're probably going to have some less nerdy people in today on account of it being a Khamzat podcast. But the inside slip is where, from a regular boxing position, you move your head to your left. If you're orthodox versus orthodox, you slip your head to your left. Ideally, like, you're going from shoulder on the opponent's centre line and their lead shoulder on your centre line to your head on their centre line. And the inside slip's important because it moves you into inside position, which is where you follow up with left hooks and things in boxing. It allows you to throw the right hand across the top, and inside position, it allows you to, if you just step straight in with your head on the centre, you'll get a clinch and a good chance of underhooks or a body lock. If you lower your level, you can take them down. In the boxing game alone, moving your head onto the centre line, you can then level change up and down, and you've got like two levels of, or two dimensions of head movement going on there. But the inside slip is great for, you will move your body in that direction when you throw a punch with your right hand anyway. It's that squaring up we were talking about, but it's less an issue if you're not the guy terrified of being taken down. So what Khamzat does is that he'll move his head to the centre line and throw the right hand across the top. And he's hit so many dudes with that, because when people jab, if you move your head inside, you throw your right hand across the top in what is called a cross counter. It's not a cross in terms of like the straight right, it's a cross in terms of it is going across the opponent's left hand. And I believe he knocked out Meerschaert with that, but he also throws the right uppercut doing it too, which is less, it's more seldom seen. You see it quite a bit on the Russian MMA scene. I really like it. It's something that Jim Corbett, he wrote a book years and years ago, Gentleman Jim Corbett, and he insisted it was one of his favourite punches. And I believe he made Bob Fitzsimmons bite his tongue in half with an uppercut. But it's where, as the opponent jabs, you slip your head to the inside and you throw your right uppercut inside of their shoulder. And it's a bit tricky to do. Well, actually, it's not tricky to do. It's a bit more dangerous than the cross counter, which is just sort of an overhand. But you get some monster knockouts out of it. So who was it he knocked out? Ikram Aliskerov. That was the one. Beautiful. Slips inside his lead shoulder and throws the right uppercut and just starches this dude. So it's all jab, head inside, and right hand. So when we're looking at that from the opposite end, anytime someone wants to clinch up immediately, my advice to people on the other end of it, unless you are so hopelessly lost that you're like, I've got to get him out of here immediately, which some of these people are, but at the highest levels, probably not. They probably think they will be able to defend the takedowns. But set yourself up with the best chance. Just take a round to just, poke and be conscious of the takedown at every opportunity. You don't need to square up and throw the right hand. You don't need to swing. The Holly Holm Ronda Rousey example is so brilliant because for the first round, about 3 minutes of the first round, she doesn't throw anything. She just lets Ronda come after. And that's not to say that Khamzat won't be able to get a hold of you, or whoever you're fighting won't be able to get a hold of you. But it does mean that when they get a hold of you, they're going on to your underhooks. You're in better position to defend yourself. And then it's genuinely a question of can I wrestle against this guy? Half of the genius of what good wrestlers do is that they don't put you in a position to wrestle fairly with them. It's like, Floyd Mayweather's not going to trade punch for punch with you because he's not an idiot and that's not what he does. Or at least he wouldn't have, unless you're as good as Logan Paul or he's getting old. But then there's an interesting turnaround on that, because you don't want to advise anyone to be like, the most basic way of looking at counter wrestling is to go, well, I'd hit him with an uppercut or I'd hit him with a knee when they duck their head. And that's, you've seen so much bullshito about that. But when a guy like Khamzat does put his head forward and down on the center line so often to throw the overhand, to slip inside, you got to start thinking maybe the uppercut's a good weapon just generally. Not just because he's always level changing, but because he's always using the inside slip. One of the very famous examples of a guy who almost exclusively uses the inside slip cross counter in MMA, Glover Teixeira. It's basically all he does. And you'll remember both Rumble and Alexander Gustafsson lit him up with uppercuts because he kept throwing his head over his lead leg, kept throwing his head forward into the center, and they'd either take the punch or slip the punch and throw the uppercut back and smash him with his head forward. Another great example is Uriah Faber. Again, he's another guy who that was his only real punch, but he caught everyone with it. And when he fought Frankie Edgar, Edgar just answered the phone, put his left elbow up as high as possible every time that Faber came in, caught the overhand, and then hit him with an uppercut with his right hand. Obviously, Edgar, doesn't have any power at all in his punches, so it's quite easy to miss. But if you go watch that fight again, he lands like 100 uppercuts. So it would be intriguing to see someone throw a good amount of uppercuts at Khamzat when he enters. Obviously, you do have to be careful because the uppercut overhand trade-off is that you will see people get murdered with uppercuts while throwing the overhand. You'll also see people get smashed into the floor with an overhand as they're throwing an uppercut. So it's kind of a trade-off. But we're also big fans of uppercuts to the body. When people level change, if you uppercut into where their chest is going to be, you have a much lower chance of missing the uppercut and opening that elbow and the space underneath for the opponent to drop into and double leg you. If you uppercut the chest, Takanori Gomi used to do it a lot. Ricky Simone did it against Hanayaya. You lower your chances of missing catastrophically. And also, if you hit them in the chest, you're not smashing their face up, but it'll take some air out of your lungs. And that's also one of the questions that we're always asking. Nobody knows generally how good Khamzat's cardio is over the distance because he's never been over the distance. He smashes people early. But more than that, there's the additional question. He really had very, very bad long COVID. And that can have an effect on your lung capacity. I'm told. I'm dealing with it fine. But no. But then on the other end of that, Alexander Volkanovski, there were questions over whether his lung capacity would be back up to what it was. And he looked phenomenal against Ortega. In fact, outlasted him. And also beat him up every step of the way, but we'll get into that later. The important point is, there are a lot of questions over Khamzat Chimaev's later performance or late fight performance. You're always, it's a tricky one to do in a 3-round fight, because a guy can have a monster first 2 rounds, get tired towards the end of the second round, and then he could be dead on his feet in the third round, but he just has to survive. The real testing ground for that stuff is 5-round fights. Obviously, he's not far removed from them, but just unfortunate. If you're wanting to test his cardio and ending up in a 3-round fight, very unfortunate for you. But then Burns' cardio has never been amazing, to be honest. He's a very explosive front runner. Very early in the fight is when he's dangerous, and the longer the fight goes, the less explosive he looks, the more hittable he becomes. It's kind of like Michael Chandler, guys like that. All your black explosive favourites, Rumble Johnson, Gilbert Burns, Michael Chandler, Black History Month. But Michael Chandler, if you watch him against Eddie Alvarez in the second fight, he's so dangerous in the early going because he's very, very quick. But all his defensive reactions are to look at the punch, see it's coming, and pull his head away. And the further you get into the fight, the less you're able to do that because you can't move as fast as you did. Your body just gets, not your body even, but your nerves and your anticipation just slow down. So in the later rounds of that fight, Eddie Alvarez is just throwing 3 or 4 jabs at a time, and Michael Chandler can't get out of the way. But the Gilbert Burns thing is interesting because I saw a clip of them together today, and I was, Gilbert Burns came up from lightweight. Khamzat Chimaev has fought quite recently at middleweight. You would expect Chimaev to be significantly larger than him. It didn't look as bad as I was expecting, seeing them next to each other at the weigh-ins at the at the sauna. I was there. No, in this clip of them coming out of the sauna. But again, like we're getting dehydrated Khamzat Chimaev, they're going to swell up again after the weigh-ins. But, you can't change your frame. But it's quite interesting because looking at Gilbert Burns, his breakout performance was against Tyron Woodley. And Tyron Woodley, it was a very strange time because Tyron Woodley's career and ability just fell off a cliff. He had that fight against Darren Till, who was still sort of an unknown quantity. Yeah, unknown quantity. But still very, very fast, very, very dangerous. And Woodley made him look ridiculous. I don't think Darren landed a strike in that fight. And then Usman just won every minute of the fight against Woodley, and we all went, damn, this Usman must be incredible. And then Gilbert Burns won every minute of the fight against Woodley, and we were going, well, good for Gilbert Burns, but Tyron Woodley didn't really do anything. And then Colby Covington did the same against Tyron Woodley, and we went, I'm starting to think these guys might not all be as good as we think they are, and Tyron Woodley might have just fallen off a cliff. And of course, most recently, Tyron Woodley lost 2 boxing matches to Jake Paul, which is just such a strange way for him to end his career. You might not remember, but there was a time, like 2 or 3 title defenses in, people were going, well, he's getting close to the GSP talk. We've got to start considering, is he a better fighter than GSP was? But anyway, as I was saying, the game plan that Burns brought into that fight, he seemed very well prepared for the idea of Woodley throwing the overhand right and trying to clinch off it, or level changing onto the hips and then trying to come out of the clinch with the right hand. He seemed very well prepared for those 2 possibilities. So in that fight, there were a lot of levels there was a few levels to his game plan, but he was reaching out with both hands to check Tyron Woodley's hands to stop him from throwing or to complicate the path of his punches. And Henry Hooft in the corner was saying, when you can touch him, kick, or when you can touch his hands, kick. That was a thing that people were getting confused by. They were like, so he's telling him to kick whenever he can punch him, and that wasn't the case. He was telling him to throw the calf kick anytime he could touch Woodley's hands, which is can be a significant difference from where you can actually reach out and hit him. And the calf kick is obviously a great weapon to chop away at wrestlers if you can get them engaging you in the stand-up fight, because if they're standing up, it's hard for them to change down onto the calf kick. It doesn't ride up like the traditional low kick into the thigh, which guys can just bend their knee into it. The leg will slide up into their hip and they'll run through it like Tyron Woodley did to Wonder Boy. And I think he might have done it to Till as well. But if you kick below the knee, it can't ride up because that's how the leg is lined. The shin is going straight down into the floor. It's not on an angle up towards the hip. And they just seem to take effect quicker. But it's a great way to annoy people. It's a great way to hurt wrestlers with only a few blows. So yeah, possibly. You can still reach down and catch it. It's just a bit trickier. If you watch Conor McGregor versus Dustin Poirier 2, he's reaching down, he's catching it. He's having to run after Dustin with the whole leg in between them. Dustin's foot is sort of in the way of him. He can't just run through, punch him in the face and tumble him over, which is what happens when you kick the thigh and it rides up. But then the other part of Burns' game plan was that he was trying to he'd drop away from Woodley's charges off the fence. He forced Woodley to the fence because he knew Woodley would swing off it, and then he'd sort of pick his battles. So he'd flee from Woodley a couple of times and then push him back to the fence, and then maybe on the second or third time he would hit him with a counter right hand or a counter right uppercut, which is quite interesting for this fight because the counter right uppercut could work a treat in some situations here. But yeah, what I'm saying is the game plan that they came in with preparing for Tyron Woodley could be the right sort of game plan to deal with Khamzat Chimaev. Obviously, probably more likely to get taken down and have to grapple at some point. The difference is, of course, Chimaev's a lot bigger than Woodley, and also that game plan might not have even worked against Woodley if Woodley was still Woodley. We're all sort of convinced now that Woodley stopped being Woodley sometime before or just after the Usman fight. And this all fits in really interestingly because Gilbert Burns got that fight because they had to cancel Leon Edwards versus Tyron Woodley because they weren't able to get the event going in the UK. And they were like, Leon, get to Heathrow. And he was like, I'm 4 hours drive from Heathrow. I think the ground game here is compelling because Gilbert Burns, obviously, a bit of a legend in the jiu-jitsu scene, but he's a legend in that he basically pioneered using the 50-50 position in the gi, And if you know the 50-50 position, it is a very dangerous position when heel hooks are allowed. But because of the gi, they don't allow heel hooks in the gi just because it's friction and it's so hard to slip your heel and get away from things. So the 50-50 in the gi is literally just trying to get on top and get an advantage. And it was a very boring style. And then he came to MMA and became a knockout artist, and everyone went, it's like he's trying to redeem himself for the impact he had on the jiu-jitsu meta for quite a while. But it's been a while since I've seen him grappling really effectively. He took down Woodley a couple of times, but even Woodley was able to get up with a classical underhook half guard get up, which was quite impressive. I wrote an article after the fight, and I basically said Woodley looked completely shot, Burns looked great, but look at this cool get up from Tyron Woodley. But the way that everyone looks at it is they go, oh, jiu-jitsu black belt, jiu-jitsu legend, let's see his guard or whatever against Khamzat Chimaev. And of course, most of the bottom game in MMA is not playing the guards. I mean, some guys have managed to maneuver it into playing the guard, so you can watch Ryan Hall get taken down and actually play his guard. Charles Oliveira is obviously always going to be the best example of someone who just attacks from their back and barely ever wall walks, to be honest. Brian Ortega, yeah, same, but not as effective. You know, you feel like he's a bit more limited by being convinced that he only has to attack from the bottom and never wall walk, whereas Charles Oliveira, it's more like he can wall walk, but he's just so active from the bottom that he doesn't care about it. What I'm saying is that Charles Oliveira is a better fighter. But yes, Gilbert Burns is going to be the smaller man here. He's probably going to end up on the bottom at some point. It'll be very interesting to see what he does. Does he turn off the fence and try to play some kind of guard, stall Chimaev out, wear him down? And to be honest, if you're waiting for the third round, there could be some value to trying to use the guard to tie him up or put knee shields in front of his chest and just prevent him from hitting decently. But you're always dealing with that time issue because every second you spend on the bottom is a second you're losing, and the onus is on you to get up. So most people prefer to try and wall walk, and I think at the moment people are getting better at countering the wall walk than they are at doing the wall walk, or at least breaking away once they've achieved the upright position from the wall walk. When you factor in the weight, the size difference as well, it doesn't look too promising for Burns. But again, it's been a while since I've watched him have to, or seen him have to wall walk. Even though Gilbert Burns there's a lot more footage on him, he's still an unknown in some areas for me. In the same way that Khamzat is an unknown almost everywhere outside of the first minute of the fight and outside of the fight going entirely his way within the first minute. If I had to say what I'm really feeling about this fight, I don't think that Gilbert Burns is the kind of fighter to pull off an intelligent game plan against Khamzat Chimaev. Even if he fought the best game plan in the world and it was just physically too much for him to deal with a guy this size and this skill level. I don't think he'll even attempt it, to be honest. I think he'll probably try and swang and bang early on and get taken down probably much easier than he should have. But I'm looking forward to it. It's one of the more compelling fights on this card, and it isn't even that compelling. So, as in, there's a bit of a foregone conclusion there for most people looking at that fight going, that doesn't seem like a great matchup for Gilbert Burns. But it gets worse as we go down the card. So let's do those then. Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. I think it would be very... I don't know if it's worth going into this at any great length. I was listening to the Heavy Hands boys. This was last week, I think they were talking about it. But they were saying it's sort of a similar matchup to the Ortega one in that you've got a guy with good boxing, decent hands, decent power, good counter punches, and a really dangerous ground game with a sort of disconnect in that a lot of the time he can't get the fight there. And to be honest, the Korean Zombie I don't think has as hard a time as Ortega does. The Korean Zombie, it was more a case that he'd never fought any real competent wrestlers until he met Jose Aldo, and then he went away for 2 years to do his military service. I think it worked out more like 3. But when he came back, he was booked to fight Dennis Bermudez. And I remember writing the article about him coming back and making the realization that this is the first good wrestler he's fought who isn't Jose Aldo. So we still are going to learn something interesting about him. And he actually looked really good in that fight. And I think he got Ige off his feet a few times. He's not bad in the wrestling, as opposed to Brian Ortega, who we've seen fight not great wrestlers and also fail at almost every takedown. He was 1 for 9 in takedowns across his UFC career going into his first title shot. And that was against Max Holloway. I mean, that was a pretty easy fight to like do the preview of, because you go, well, yeah, I like Ortega's boxing, but if he doesn't outright beat Max Holloway, one of the best strikers in MMA and one of the most adaptable strikers in MMA on the feet, what are his options? He can't really do anything else. Because if you can't control that middle bit to some extent, you don't have to be an amazing wrestler, but you do need to be able to make an opening to get a guy down, and Ortega just can't. Second time slagging off Brian Ortega this episode. But yeah, you talk about Volkanovski. If you want to learn more about my opinions on Volkanovski, I wrote a very long study on him very recently called Advanced Striking 2.0 Alexander Volkanovski. You can find it on my Patreon. Full of doodles by me. It's all talking all about how, as the smaller man, he still uses outside weapons to set up a lot of his punches, and a lot of his, because people don't want to let him close enough to hit them, a lot of what he can do is use his low kicks to get the opponent coming back in on him and then counterpunch off that. I'll be very interested to see that against the Korean Zombie, because he had some horrible time with low kicks from Yair Rodriguez, because he does that like lean heavy on the lead leg, moving your head left to right and waiting for the opponent to jab at you so you can slip it, and then he just gets hammered in the lead leg. So very interesting to see how he deals with that. I can see him running onto counters by trying to get one back on the low kicks, which is the classic MMA answer. If you get low kicks, try and punch them in the face while they're on one leg, and then they'll stop kicking you, hopefully. It's kind of like why you swing back when someone throws a high kick, because you're like, I don't want him to do that very much. I'd like him to be scared at least a little bit to do that. But there will be openings for the Korean Zombie here, like the uppercut. I feel like I've said that too much this episode. I'm giving people the idea that you could just go out and load up uppercuts, and you got a good chance of beating the best guys in the world. But specifically because Volkanovski's shorter, because he likes to level change into head-on chest clinches to stuff the action sometimes, and because the Korean Zombie actually has a pretty good uppercut of his own. And anytime you talk about height disparity like that, uppercuts are a good shout. Trying to crowd Volkanovski to the fence, I think, is a good idea, because what happens to a lot of people is that they fight him out in the open, and if he wants to put the pace on you like he did against Ortega, you watch that fight, he's putting the pace on Ortega, they clinch up, the referee breaks them, and he's immediately up in Ortega's face again, and Ortega's back is to the fence the entire time. At that point, despite being the shorter man with the shorter arms, and actually he's got quite long arms for his build, but being the shorter man punching upwards, having to deal with all those like disadvantages in length, Volkanovski is controlling the distance, because if your back's to the fence, you don't get a say in the distance. You get the choice between stepping in on him as he steps in on you, or backing into the fence, and then you don't have anywhere to run. So having your back to the fence allows Volkanovski to control all that. I think. And Volkanovski, with his many, many feints, his step-up low kicks, his beautiful step-up feints to get inside, he manages to hide his entries really well. So there's a lot of like point scoring with the low kicks and the middle kicks and things, but they hide the entries for big punches. And that's a big part of his identity. Like, if he couldn't crack people on the inside when they get cheeky or hang around too long, people wouldn't be worried about it. He wouldn't be as effective with his feints and his outside kickboxing game. But if you put his back to the fence, you take away a lot of that subtlety, a lot of that cleverness about his game, and a lot of that. I mean, he does keep a high pace and he throws a lot of strikes, but there's an awful lot of feinting in between, and there's a lot of thinking. If you put his back to the fence, you put a bit more impetus on him. You go, okay, work from there, and then he's got the choice between staying on the fence and letting you run up into flying knees and whatever, or coming to you. And obviously, if you're someone like the Korean Zombie or someone taller than him, as most people are, if you put him to the fence and you show a jab or you move in to feint with your shoulder, there's a good chance he level changes. And then you can hit him with an uppercut, you can try and knee him, you can grab his head and try and snap him down. Because that's a standard short man move, that's a standard Alex Volkanovski move. As the opponent comes in on you on the fence, level change into their chest, turn them onto the fence with the body lock. So I think there are some chances for Korean Zombie to be tricky here. I think he's a bit long in the tooth. And I think he's also fighting a fighter who's as good as any other fighter he's fought. He's fought Jose Aldo in his prime, but Jose Aldo in his prime would let people into fights by doing less. Whereas this one, if Volkanovski works out he's better than Korean Zombie early, he's going to then push that for 25 minutes. So I imagine that the Korean Zombie's going to have a worse time in here with Volkanovski than he would if he were dropping rounds to Aldo. But this would be a really nice, happy ending for Korean Zombie. And of course, there's always the chance that he's just a bit of a curveball, because this is it's not a Michael Bisping last-minute replacement, but it is a fairly late replacement for the Holloway trilogy. Plus, Korean Zombie, has he ever had a boring fight? It would be so cool if he won a UFC belt, because, you just have an explosion of MMA in Korea. We can get some Taekwondo, some legit Taekwondo world champions, not the Valerie Lareda kind. Side note, people were posting this, pay sheet the other week. There was the last UFC event did take place somewhere where they published the pay sheet, which is very interesting. And if they do that, people like MMA Fighting and MMA Junkie, established names in the sport, will post that. But before that, like the Paddy Pimblett card, people were posting this just made up pay sheet and be like, disgraceful. You're going, well, no, lying about what the pay is doesn't help. Can we not just judge them on the actual shitty pay and not just make up our own pay? And the same website that was saying Jack Shaw got this, Paddy Pimblett got that, Jack Shaw came in and said, no, I didn't get that on the actual post. But the same website said that Volkanovski is getting, before this fight they said we got the purses, which they didn't. They're just lying. It's just this small site with a dude with no Twitter following is the only guy posting on it. And I think it's called Sportal Portal or Sport Portal. They had this Volkanovski's going to get $400,000 and Korean Zombie's going to get $500,000, no win bonuses. And again, that's never how that's worked in the UFC. And if you think the Korean Zombie's getting $500,000 for a fight, you're mental. Hell, maybe he is, but someone reputable will report it. There's a reason that the UFC very rarely hosts fights in places where they are required to post the payouts. And then the other one is Yan versus Aljo. I think that's, again, a lot of people are looking at this as a foregone conclusion. I mean, the way I look at it is that, I believe Aljo is a skilled enough fighter that he could make life very tricky for Petr Yan. He did for the first 2 rounds of their first match, but he did it by spazzing out and exhausted himself. So in the 3rd and 4th round, it was just Yan throwing him around, basically. And the other thing is that, the way that Aljo strikes is so overcommitted and so zany looking that when he's tired, it's really obvious he's tired and he just looks like shit. There have been fighters who are quite good at hiding when they're knackered, and they'll take a break. I hate to mention Floyd Mayweather positively twice in one podcast, but if he was hurt or he was tired, he would feint and get you off him, or he'd go on the front foot and back you onto the ropes, but not really be hitting you and get a breather that way. Whereas Aljo's only way of getting a breather was to spaz out and try and keep Petr Yan off him, having done that for the first 2 rounds and exhausted himself. I think if you're Aljo and you're going to get back into this, it's got to be, I'd say, don't try and push him back and do all the flying knees and bollocks like that. The long body kicks were working. Low kicks have always annoyed Petr Yan. He does answer high kicks quite well. He uses them to sweep people off their feet, which is a great way to counter high kicks and make people reluctant to use them. But the long kicks were working, and honestly, for Aljo, just John Jones / the Paul Craig, now I'm calling it. It was the John Jones game plan to circle and use your kicks and elbows instead of punching a great deal. But now I'm calling it the Paul Craig game plan, because he's the real hero of light heavyweight. For Yan, do the same thing as last time. If he gets tired after round 2 and you've got a free target for the rest of the fight, great. But try not to cheat, which honestly, quite hard for Petr Yan. Fucking loves cheating. Was it Aldo he didn't cheat against? There was someone he didn't cheat against. Might have been Faber, actually. They seem to have a very cordial relationship, and he didn't cheat against him. But every other fight is just grab your hair, grab your shorts, poke your eyes. It's so funny because he's the best fighter in the world without cheating, and then he just cheats anyway. It's real Ric Flair shit. Everyone talks about the knee, but he headbutted him in the back of the head first. And the other fight that he lost in his career was by headbutting a guy, getting warned, and then doing it again in the 5th round in a very close fight. And then afterwards, the comments on that YouTube video are all, Yan won this, it was a robbery. And you're like, he knew the rules. There isn't anywhere that headbutting's legal. In MMA, at least. So yeah, to be honest, just want this one over and done with. I wouldn't be shocked if LJ gives a better performance than expected, and then people change completely 180 overnight. They go, oh, I could watch 100 fights between those two. Having been the entire time up to this, remembering it as Aljo didn't win a second of the first fight. Someone was telling me, like, Aljo got dominated for 25 minutes solid the first time around. I'm like, fight ended before the 25-minute mark, and also he lost the first two, or Aljo won the first 2 rounds. Which is pretty crazy, because, like, throwing back to my friends at the Heavy Hands podcast, they were talking about this, but Petr Yan is now in the position where everyone's like, damn, him and Volkanovski, probably pound for pound best in the world. Also, I've seen them spar. I'm even more excited for the idea of them fighting now. But there was a while where Aljamain Sterling was beating the up-and-coming contenders, and Petr Yan was against 40-year-old Uriah Faber for no reason, and then 40-year-old Jose... Well, Aldo's actually much younger than that, but, 15 years of fighting already, Jose Aldo. And everyone's going, damn, Petr Yan, why are you fighting like old men while Aljo's fighting the best in the world? And now it's sort of switched, firstly because of how we realised that Jose Aldo is still that bitch. He's fantastic. And the win over Aljo, obviously, or the near win over Aljo, the performance against Aljo, rather, and the win over Corey Sandhagen, who's also super legit. So it's interesting how that sort of perception has shifted. That was so bizarre. They booked Petr Yan versus Uriah Faber and Dominic Cruz versus Henry Cejudo about the same time. I think it was originally Aldo versus Cejudo, which would have been slightly more interesting. But it's just like, yep, kill the old dudes. They're putting over the younger generation. Because the UFC has always been like absolutely hopeless at selling the lighter divisions. Everyone who watches this shit goes, bantamweight, there are no bad fights at bantamweight. But the UFC still somehow cannot make the number one guy at bantamweight at any one time into a star. Which always kind of annoys me, because like as a promoter you have one job, to promote the fight. And when people are going like, oh, you got to promote yourself, you're going, well, no, my job is to be the fighter. I was hoping the guy with promoter in their job title would promote me. Which I suppose brings us on to Ian Gary. No, don't give a shit about this. I mean, he's an interesting prospect, but like his first fight was like Paddy Pimblett's first fight, in that he got chinned almost immediately and looked bad. And then he got on the mic afterwards. And they're now trying to push him as like the next great wit in MMA. The only thing anyone remembers him saying is, a great man once said, and then quoting Conor McGregor. That's not having a personality. Being from the same place and saying the things he already said is not being the next McGregor. That's not interesting. I mean, as tedious as McGregor's talk got, back in the day he was pretty quick-witted and charming. Ian Gary, I just watched a 5-minute video of him at the press conference, him telling people how good he is at talking and stuttering through the entire thing. I watched him come up in Cage Warriors, and he was very interesting then. I'm just, it's just weird whenever someone is trying to be like the next McGregor by being literally Conor McGregor, or trying to. And the last time he fought, he had herpes on his face, which was just bizarre. It blows my mind that commissions still allow that. Like, there was one where Kevin Lee came in with a giant staph infection on his chest. Ian Gary comes in with herpes, and the last thing you want to do is clinch him. Maybe that's the game plan. Maybe. I've heard weirder ones, because Matt Lindland used to not shower for several weeks before fighting. Joachim Hansen also. Just like, oh yeah? No? Well, when I'm grappling you, I want you to be uncomfortable. And if you want to try and grapple me, I want you to not do it. So I'm just going to make sure I smell like absolute shit. Honestly, rancid. One of the grossest. I'm if I grappled with someone like that, I'd probably throw up. But then, anywhere you roll, dudes be smelling like low tide at Nantucket. Not me. I smell like excellence. So what else is good on this card? Ooh. Mackenzie Dern versus Tisha Torres. I mean, the main compelling thing about that is that Tisha Torres doesn't get finished. She's always there. And Mackenzie Dern gets hella tired after round 2. Mackenzie Dern is great because Perillo has taught her to jab, and she actually has a really nice jab now. But obviously, after you throw the jab, you want to do something after it. And anytime she throws a right hand or a kick after it, it just looks like soccer mum in cardio kickboxing class. So she's got this really good jab, which is much better than most women on the roster. And then just everything after it is awful. But she's got the jiu-jitsu, which is always intriguing. But Tisha Torres had really close fights with like, she had a really close one with Weili Zhang. So Zhang Weili. It's just that she's not very interesting. I mean, she's got quite an interesting style in terms of you're looking at it and going, oh, there's not a lot of people doing that. But it's not interesting in that I would way rather watch someone like Colby Covington shoot. I mean, I'm saying this as the striking guy, as a guy who made his career writing about striking and striking strategies and tactics. But I would much rather watch someone wrestle, fail to take someone down, but keep changing and chaining different takedown attempts than I would watch someone like Mano Fioro. What's her name? Mano Fioro? The big lass, or there was someone else doing this the other week, but just throwing the same combination over and over again and not really hurting anyone. If there's no threat to your strikes, I'm not interested in watching you strike. Which brings us on to Jairzinho Rosa. Actually, no, Jairzinho Rosa's stroke is not the case because if he does hit people, he can sleep them. It's just that he spends most of the fight going, "Oh, I don't know if I want to hit him." Martin Tibura is the heavyweight who can't knock people out, so that one will be odd. Aspen Ladd's back against Raquel Pennington. Raquel Pennington is an extremely boring fighter who clinches people and then complains about them clinching her. It's so good. But honestly, just kind of hope for Aspen Ladd to get a win here because she's doing so badly in her recent career, and she used to be quite promising. Mickey Gall versus Mike Malott. Cool. Alexei Olenek versus Jared. Fluffy Hernandez is back. Someone used that as a selling point of the card. They were like, yeah, Fluffy Hernandez is on it. And you go, he beat one guy who was famous. That's not... It was mainly by that guy fucking up too, so I don't know if that's a selling point. Kay Hansen, back to push the OnlyFans. Oh, Julio Arce. I love Julio Arce. He's against Daniel Santos in the opening prelim. Julio Arce, good fighter, but coming off a rough loss to Song Yadong. And that's about it, to be honest. I'm going to go back to making the Filthy Casuals guide to Patricio Pitbull for next week. There you go, people who cry that I never cover Bellator positively. I am doing more than anyone in the MMA media to actually fucking cover that fight. In fact, I didn't know that fight was happening until last week because Bellator aren't covering that fight. But anyway, apologies if this has been rambling. I'm on quite a lot of cough medicine. And apologies if I sound like shit. I'm on a bad mic and I sound like shit. But I will be back on Monday to talk about the fights that happened. If I get a negative test before then, I will try and get a Slacky's film room or something in for the boys. If you want to support the podcast, get in on the extra stuff, sign up to the Patreon. If you want to send an email to the podcast, jackslackpodcast@gmail.com. And if you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. I am your boy, Jack Slack. Lateral flow grappling bless.